let's talk about some of his more controversial stuff. You touched
Mm-hmm.
on it briefly. You touched on the jokes towards the LGBTQ community, or specifically the transgender community.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can't do a podcast about Dave without touching on this, because this is kind of, it's an unfortunate.
I wouldn't want
Like I
to.
said,
I
in
definitely
my
wouldn't. Yeah.
you want to?
No, I definitely wouldn't want to do a podcast without touching on that stuff. Yeah,
Exactly.
agreed.
Here's the challenge. Whenever we talk about this issue, and this issue in particular, I want to make sure that I'm articulate in this moment and then I can be understood. I think it's important to start the conversation with an understanding that there are two values in conflict on the question of, comics being offensive. And the two values have to do with the freedom of speech, and then also the freedom and the right to feel included and respected. And I think those are two important values. And I think we have to start there. So one of the last things I want to, like, if someone is really certain about the concept of like free speech always, like, I don't value that. And then the other idea that we should restrict free speech when someone is bothered by it, I'm not fully there either. And I think we need to just kind of crystallize what the problem is. In my view, the issue has to do with powerful platforms and media. And so the issue, for instance, with like 1950s Hollywood, you're dealing with like an exclusive club of storytellers who are pumping the eyes, the ears, and the minds of millions of people with a narrow set of stories, right? Because they're all generally like sort of white people with access back then. And so as a black dude from Brooklyn, those storytellers, they don't care about me and my story. They don't know how to tell my story.
Yeah.
They couldn't do it. Even if they tried, they could only produce a very base, warped version of me. And the problem is that they're robbing me of my opportunity to introduce myself to the world. They can't articulate my uniqueness. And so they're stuck with this caricature. And so if that's the problem, if you agree with me that that's the problem, I think the way to fix that, and the right argument for fixing that, is to include more voices. And that's something we've been hearing so much. And that's part of the like Oscars so white movement and all this stuff. I think the goal is to expand speech as wide as possible, not to constrict it. I think that the internet gives us a ghost of a chance to achieve that. A ghost of a chance, because we haven't achieved it. The hope is that the jokes and the films and the ideas can stand side by side, and it can be like, yo, I'm funny too. I have a funny take on that same idea, but from my angle. So I can notice irony and drama. I can tell that story. And so while Hollywood has their 1920s story of America from like the perspective of Howard Hughes, right? The aviator with the planes and all that stuff. And I could say, yo, I could talk about 1920s America, but it wasn't roaring for everybody.
Yeah.
That decade wasn't just that so simple. And so I don't know the person, but I think there's a comic out there who is currently a butt of one of Dave Chappelle's jokes. But they're also very funny, and they're refining their craft the way that Dave Chappelle has, and they're speaking honestly the way that Dave Chappelle does, and they're poking fun at themselves and poking fun at cisgender culture and shit, right? Which is fertile ground. They're poking fun at like the dumb shit that men do and masculinity and the rest of it, and it's weird sometimes, and perhaps it would be like a little off-putting for me or us maybe. But the goal is to get that person access to all the mics and the stages, and if they're funny, that their narrative will find the audience and we'll all be enriched by that additional story and that additional perspective and that additional humor. And so I hope I've described that well, but my instinct is to try and elevate more voices and not to kind of, I'm always very wary of efforts that are constricting and sort of punitive in nature.
Yeah.
And I think more voices are being heard all the time. We're seeing it happen, and we just need to kind of propel that and make that happen more quickly. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree in principle. I think Dave Chappelle a bit disingenuously appeals to that free speech argument. The concept of free speech is inseparable from power, right? So it's when somebody with power, typically the government, but it could also be a major corporation or whatever, is censoring you or is somehow not allowing you to say your truth. And so when he says something like, you're never allowed to rule number one of Hollywood, or I forget how he phrases it, it's like, you're never allowed to upset the alphabet people. And he gets into the alphabet people being the LGBTQ movement. And well, dude, it's like, this is your 5th Netflix special, the biggest platform on earth, in which you're talking about what you call the alphabet people, getting paid $20 million a show, from what I can tell. That doesn't sound like a free speech issue. Like that, it's a bit of a disingenuous. Where does it come from? It comes from what I think is worth talking about, which is kind of the response of when somebody says something that you believe is harmful, is discriminatory, is to label them that thing instead of talking about the thing they said. It's to say that person is that thing, is in this case transphobic or whatever, and they have a good argument, but still, instead of kind of like engaging and being like Dave Chappelle, you do a lot of great work. Can we work with you? Can we like talk about this thing? I don't know what that looks like, but the idea of that, like, okay, he needs to be gone, right? So like, this guy can never be seen again. He needs to be erased from the face of the earth because of these jokes that he's made. Like, that approach makes it feel like a free speech issue, but I still feel like it's not there at all, because the money and the Netflix exposure and all that stuff shows that Dave Chappelle is not the victim of a free speech attack, of an attack on free speech. Like, the people who feel under attack by his comedy, I could totally see that. Like, I could totally see how people make the connection, like, hate speech is illegal, right? Like, you're not allowed to say this group of people is like this, and so we should attack them, or like they should not have access to clean drinking water, or whatever the hell it is. It's like, you can't legally do that, because we understand that there's a connection between me saying those words, especially if I'm somebody of influence, and then harm coming as a result of it, right? Directly. So what people are saying here is that his comedy is like, when it comes to women in many ways, when it comes to the LGBT community in many ways, it's not as nuanced as his stuff around race. It's pretty one-sided, and it propels and perpetuates a lot of kind of dangerous stereotypes. If you look at kind of the statistics that show that, trans people, for example, are more likely to be the victims of violence, and they are targeted for hate crimes. So people can make a connection with like real events here. And the fact that, he kind of proudly goes out and says, like, I'm not listening to you. It's like, I am like proudly not listening to you. When I think he showed great courage, almost like Muhammad Ali level courage, in turning down $50 million when he felt like his ethics were under question in terms of like the influence he was having in the world and things like this. It is sad for me to see him not taking that to heart. I'll give an example. He'll come out and he always does this. He'll set up, he'll wax virtuous, but he's setting you up for a punchline, right? So he'll come out and says, your personal choices, I forget exactly what he says. Something like that. He comes out and says, your personal choices do not disqualify you from a life of dignity, happiness, and safety. And then he'll get like a little applause, and then and then a little bit later, he's talking about how Caitlyn Jenner in Sports Illustrated, and he says, if
I had read in the paper that Caitlyn Jenner was contemplating posing nude in an upcoming issue of Sports Illustrated, and I know it's not politically correct to say these things, so I just figured, fuck it, I'll say it for everybody else. Yuck.
I'm just going to say what everybody's thinking. Yuck. The idea that Caitlyn Jenner would be in this Sports Illustrated thing. Well, part of dignity and happiness for many people.
Did he say that?
Yeah. And it's like, it's like part of dignity and happiness for many people is it the idea that they could be attractive to somebody. they could be sexually attractive. So the idea that just the idea that a trans person is going to be in the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition is, and then he says, I'll see what we're all thinking, is like, yuck. And everybody's like, oh yeah, blah, blah, blah. Like that sucks. Like you can, this is one where I do think you can make, he gets really frustrated when people make analogies to race, but I think this one you could. Like, 1974, Beverly Anderson is the first Black woman to be on the cover of Vogue, right? And you can imagine that if like Bob Hope or some comedian back then was like, I'm just going to say what we're all saying, what we're all thinking here. Yuck. It's like, obviously that would be horrible. Right.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is a direct analogy. To say that like this group can't be sexy is an attack on their dignity.
For sure.